It started as a whisper, a strange, barely noticeable ripple in the chaos of everyday news cycles. A rumor passed through encrypted channels, whispered among Washington insiders, dismissed by skeptics, until it exploded into global headlines. Elon Musk had made an unprecedented, direct phone call to President Joe Biden. No intermediaries, no scheduled discussions, just a late-night, urgent conversation between the world's most powerful businessman and the leader of the free world. The leak didn't specify what Musk had demanded, but it didn't have to. The reaction from the White House, complete and utter silence, was enough to confirm that something massive was unfolding behind closed doors. Washington reporters, known for their persistence, pounced. Emails were sent. Sources were contacted. The White House press room, usually a predictable mix of diplomatic vagueness and political posturing, suddenly became a minefield of nervous glances and calculated evasions. The administration wasn't denying the call. They simply weren't acknowledging it at all. This, of course, only made the story more explosive. As speculation spread like wildfire, the world turned to the one person who could confirm or debunk the rumors. Elon Musk. He said nothing. No press conferences. No official statements. Instead, he did what he always did when the world demanded answers. He tweeted, "For words, 2 roads, 1 future. No further context. No elaboración." The tweet sent shockwaves across the internet. Within minutes, it had been shared millions of times. Analysts scrambled to decipher its meaning. Was it a warning? A choice? A declaration of war against the political establishment? Every theory was wilder than the last. Some believed it was about Mars colonization. Others were convinced it was about AI, robotics, or a radical new Tesla invention. But a small, more cynical group of observers suspected something far more dangerous. What if Musk's words weren't metaphorical at all? What if the 2 roads were real choices? One where his demand was met, and another where the world was forced to deal with the consequences of rejection. The tweet wasn't a comment. It was a message to world leaders. And it was not a request. As panic set in among financial markets and government offices, a leaked email emerged from an anonymous White House insider. The message was short, and its meaning chilling. Musk's demand, it claimed, wasn't about business. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about political influence. It was something far bigger. If the president agreed, the world as it existed today would cease to function as we know it. If the president refused, humanity might not survive what came next. The email contained no details, no specifics, just that warning. Reporters were left scrambling. What could Musk possibly have asked for that held such weight? Was it new technology? A shift in global power? Something hidden from the public eye? There was no way to know for sure. But the world didn't have to wait long for the next piece of the puzzle. A day after Musk's tweet, a high-ranking military official was seen exiting the West Wing of the White House in a hurry. The man was General Robert Sinclair, the head of U.S. Cyber Command, a division responsible for national security threats involving advanced technology. Sinclair was not the kind of man called in for corporate disputes. His presence suggested that Musk's demand wasn't just important, it was dangerous. By now, the media had fully mobilized. Cameras, reporters, analysts, everyone wanted answers. They got nothing. Then came another twist. A classified memo surfaced, heavily redacted, but unmistakably real. It revealed that the Pentagon had already been investigating Musk's demand long before the phone call happened, which meant that Washington had known this was coming. And yet, they had still been caught off guard. Markets began to tremble. Investors, corporations, even foreign governments started bracing for impact. Stock analysts warned of unprecedented volatility. Some suggested pulling investments from traditional energy sectors, while others placed sudden and aggressive bets on Musk companies. The ripple effect reached as far as Beijing and Moscow. While the American government remained silent, foreign intelligence agencies were actively monitoring the situation. They weren't just watching Musk. They were preparing for whatever came next. As pressure mounted, investigative journalists secured an internal White House transcript, one that captured the moment Biden had responded to Musk's demand. Most of the document was blacked out, Entire sections vanished behind heavy redaction. But at the very bottom, one word remained untouched. No, that was it. The entirety of Biden's response to whatever Musk had demanded. One word, no. And that single denial carried more weight than any speech, any policy announcement, any statement the president had ever made. Because if Musk had really called Biden at 2:14 a.m., if he had really made a demand that could alter the course of human history, then this wasn't just another tech billionaire throwing his weight around. This was something far more dangerous. Because Musk, unlike politicians, wasn't a man who took no for an answer. And he had the resources, the influence, and the intelligence to move forward, with or without the government's permission. Now, the world faced an impossible question. Had President Biden just saved the world from an uncontrollable disruption? Or had he just doomed humanity by rejecting the one person capable of solving the crisis no one knew was coming? The answer was out there. And Musk? He wasn't going to wait for permission to reveal it. The world didn't have time to process what had just happened. The leak, the cryptic tweet, the Pentagon's involvement, it was all spiraling too fast. Markets were in turmoil, government officials were scrambling, and intelligence agencies across the globe were suddenly treating Elon Musk as something far more than just a billionaire entrepreneur. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just what Musk had demanded. It was why the White House had responded with such immediate, unwavering refusal. Biden's single word, no, wasn't just a rejection. It was a line in the sand. But Musk wasn't a man who waited for permission. And by the time Washington realized what was happening, he had already begun his next move. The world would soon learn that they weren't dealing with a man who played by the rules. They were dealing with someone who rewrote them. While political analysts debated theories on live television and internet forums burned with speculation, something far more critical was unfolding behind closed doors. The White House wasn't just in damage control mode. It was in full-blown containment crisis. Meetings were being held at an alarming frequency. High-ranking officials were working around the clock, their discussions locked behind heavy security clearances. The press could sense the tension, but no one had answers. The reality, however, was more disturbing than anyone outside the administration could have imagined. Because Biden's rejection of Musk's demand hadn't ended the situation. It had escalated it. And now, they weren't just worried about Musk. They were worried about what he might do next. The first real sign of trouble came just 24 hours after the leak. A small but critical shift in global infrastructure went unnoticed by the general public. But within government circles, it sent shockwaves. A high-level cyber intelligence team detected something unusual, a disruption in the usual communication patterns between satellite networks. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the origin was undeniable. It was coming from Starlink. At first, analysts weren't sure what to make of it. Starlink, Musk's satellite-based internet project, had been operating for years, providing global coverage to underserved regions. It had even played a critical role in various humanitarian efforts. But something had changed. The network wasn't just operating as usual. It was reconfiguring itself. And the timing? Too perfect to be a coincidence. By the time government cybersecurity teams tried to determine what was happening, another shift occurred. This time, it was in a completely different sector. The energy grid. Tesla's network of power storage systems, solar technology, and AI-driven energy management had always been seen as an innovation until that moment. Because now, in real time, entire portions of the grid were being rerouted. Not by government agencies, not by power companies, but by an AI-driven system directly linked to Musk's network of companies. It became undeniable. Musk wasn't waiting for approval. He wasn't asking permission. He was already implementing whatever he had demanded, and the White House had no way to stop it. It wasn't long before the intelligence community came to a singular, terrifying conclusion. Musk wasn't leveraging one technology. He was synchronizing them all. Individually, his ventures were impressive, but together, they were something far greater. A global infrastructure capable of functioning outside traditional government oversight. A self-sustaining energy, communication, and AI-driven ecosystem. One that no world leader had ever fully accounted for. And now, Musk was wielding it like a weapon. The panic inside the White House was unprecedented. They had denied him. But what if the world didn't? What if foreign governments saw Musk's network as a viable alternative to traditional energy, telecommunications, and defense systems? What if, for the first time in modern history, a private individual had built something more powerful than a government itself? That was no longer a hypothetical. It was happening. At exactly 3 a.m., an emergency intelligence briefing was called. Only the highest level officials were present. A select few members of the military, intelligence, and economic advisory teams were given access to the unfiltered truth. Satellite imaging confirmed that Starlink nodes had been strategically adjusted, granting Musk's system the ability to operate autonomously, without reliance on U.S. infrastructure. Energy models indicated that Tesla's AI-driven power network had restructured itself, effectively making portions of the grid resistant to governmental shutdown. And most disturbingly, encrypted reports from global financial analysts suggested that several foreign nations were quietly attempting to open negotiations with Musk himself. Not as a businessman, but as a sovereign entity. Governments had started considering the unthinkable. If Musk could provide limitless, government-free energy, if he could control the world's most advanced satellite system, if he could redefine financial transactions through AI-driven automation, what exactly was stopping them from bypassing traditional alliances and dealing with him directly? The world was no longer asking whether Musk's demand had been reasonable. It was asking whether governments were even relevant anymore. By the next morning, the situation had spiraled beyond Washington's control. Global markets were reacting to something they couldn't fully understand. Stocks tied to traditional energy sectors were plunging. Defense contractors were scrambling. A strange pattern of financial transactions was emerging, one that suggested a massive, coordinated shift in economic power was already underway. And then, at precisely noon, Musk made his next move. Another tweet, this time just one sentence. A future built on permission is no future at all. The world understood what that meant. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't backing down. And most terrifying of all, it was no longer clear who had the real power anymore. The White House had no choice. Musk had forced their hand. The president's advisors were faced with the ultimate question. Was it still possible to contain this? Or had they, by rejecting him, unleashed something they could no longer control? Time was running out, because Musk's final move hadn't arrived yet. And when it did, the world would never be the same again. The world was still catching its breath. Governments were scrambling. Markets were in free fall. Musk's network, his silent, autonomous empire, had already begun moving. The implications were staggering. For years, his companies had been dismissed as independent ventures. A car company, a space company, a satellite internet service, a few experimental AI projects. But now it was clear, these weren't separate entities. They were pieces of a system, a machine that had quietly been assembling itself while the world wasn't paying attention. And now, that machine was running on its own. Inside the White House, a crisis meeting had been called. Every major government agency was represented: defense, energy, cybersecurity, treasury, and intelligence. The president wasn't there yet, but the discussion had already begun. The reports were disturbing. Tesla's energy grid had bypassed government oversight, making traditional energy regulation useless. Starlink satellites had shifted into new, strategically optimized positions. And strangest of all, private communications between several world leaders had abruptly changed course, shifting away from traditional diplomatic channels. The unthinkable was happening. Musk was no longer just a tech mogul. He was being treated like a government in his own right. And that, more than anything, was what terrified the officials in the room. By the time the president arrived, the mood had turned grim. His advisors didn't need to explain the stakes. He already understood them. Musk had been rejected, and now he was executing an alternative plan. The real question was simple. Could they still stop him? But stopping him wasn't as simple as issuing a legal order. The usual weapons of government, regulatory agencies, economic sanctions, even threats of prosecution, meant nothing to someone who had built his own infrastructure outside their control. They could take away his government contracts. He didn't need them. They could restrict access to U.S. power grids. He had his own. They could try to shut down his internet access. He controlled the satellites. For the first time in history, a private citizen was operating above government oversight, and there was no clear way to stop him. By nightfall, the first signs of Musk's next move began appearing. It started with a seemingly harmless press release, one that, under normal circumstances, might have been ignored. Tesla, it claimed, was preparing to roll out a revolutionary new technology, a self-sustaining, AI-powered energy system that could make entire cities energy independent overnight. No need for fossil fuels. No reliance on government-controlled power grids. No permission required. It was a complete paradigm shift, capable of rendering traditional energy markets obsolete. But the press release wasn't aimed at the public. It was aimed at world leaders, a signal that the old way of doing things was about to end. Musk wasn't just launching a new product. He was offering an alternative to governments themselves. And he wasn't waiting for permission. The markets reacted violently. Oil stocks collapsed. Traditional energy companies began emergency negotiations, trying to determine what, if anything, could be done. The U.S. government was now in full crisis mode. Because Musk wasn't just disrupting one industry. He was tearing the entire system apart. At exactly midnight, the next shift occurred. A series of coded transmissions were detected by intelligence agencies, originating from a private, highly encrypted network. Musk's AI systems had activated something new, something not yet understood. The Pentagon's cybersecurity teams were the first to raise the alarm. Because whatever had been activated, it wasn't just a communication network. It was a command system. Something had been set in motion. As intelligence teams raced to decipher what was happening, a chilling realization dawned on them. Musk wasn't just building new technology. He was restructuring power itself. What governments had always controlled, energy, communication, financial networks, was now being rerouted through a system that wasn't dependent on them anymore. And once that system was fully functional, Musk wouldn't just be outside government control. Governments would be outside of his. By dawn, the White House had run out of options. They had two choices. One, attempt to stop him by force, a move that could trigger global instability. Two, negotiate, which meant acknowledging him as a sovereign force. Both options were terrifying, but doing nothing? That wasn't an option either. And then, without warning, the final piece of Musk's plan revealed itself. A live announcement, one that would change the world forever. At precisely noon, every major broadcast network, every social media platform, and every satellite-connected device intercepted the same transmission. Musk, standing in front of a sleek, futuristic-looking backdrop, looked directly into the camera. He didn't need a teleprompter. He didn't need a government's approval. And then he spoke. The message was short, simple, and completely unprecedented. He wasn't just announcing a new invention. He wasn't just challenging governments. He was declaring something much bigger. A new order. One that would change the course of history forever. The world held its breath. Because this wasn't just about technology anymore. This was about who truly held power in the modern world. And in that moment, for the first time in history, it wasn't clear whether that answer still belonged to governments, or if it now belonged to him. The world was no longer simply watching in shock. It was standing on the precipice of a transformation so profound that no one knew whether to fear it or embrace it. Markets had already collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. Governments had issued emergency meetings behind closed doors, and intelligence agencies had reached the same unsettling conclusion. Elon Musk had just dismantled the very foundation upon which modern civilization was built, and he had done it without firing a single shot. At exactly noon, as scheduled, every screen in the world flickered to the same transmission. Musk was not seated at a desk or standing in front of an American flag like a politician addressing the public. Instead, he stood in a vast, empty facility, illuminated only by towering digital screens displaying live energy consumption, satellite trajectories, and encrypted financial algorithms. This was not the setting of a man asking for permission. This was the command center of someone who had already assumed control. There was no hesitation in his voice as he spoke. no rhetorical flourishes, no attempt to soften the gravity of what he was about to unveil. He did not introduce himself, nor did he acknowledge the global panic that had erupted in the past 24 hours. Instead, he launched straight into the heart of the matter, delivering a statement so surgically precise that those watching were left paralyzed, unsure whether they were witnessing history being rewritten or civilization unraveling before their very eyes. He declared that energy, one of the last great monopolies controlled by governments and corporate conglomerates, was no longer a commodity to be sold, rationed, or weaponized. As of that moment, Tesla's AI-managed, decentralized power grid had already begun the process of making fossil fuel-based energy production obsolete, rendering global dependence on oil and coal irrelevant. He was not proposing this as a future vision or a hypothetical scenario. He was stating that it had already happened, that the transition was irreversible, and that those who refused to adapt would simply be left behind. But it was the second half of his announcement that sent shockwaves through the world, shaking the very foundations of the economic and political order that had existed for centuries. He was not merely providing limitless energy to the world free of charge. He was introducing a financial system that would exist entirely outside of government control, one that would eliminate the necessity of central banks, traditional stock markets, and corporate gatekeepers. This new system, he explained, would be managed by an AI network immune to human corruption, political interference, or economic manipulation. Money would no longer be controlled by governments. It would be controlled by mathematics, algorithms, and decentralized intelligence. The implications were staggering. Within a single, uninterrupted speech, Musk had effectively severed the most fundamental pillars of global governance: economic power and energy control. With a few simple sentences, he had rendered entire industries irrelevant, reshaped global markets, and forced the world to choose between adaptation and collapse. The institutions that had governed society for generations no longer had a monopoly on currency, no longer controlled energy, and no longer held the technological advantage they had always relied upon to maintain dominance. As the transmission continued, financial analysts, economists, and political strategists were desperately scrambling to process what they had just heard. The implications extended far beyond Wall Street or the oil industry. This was a direct challenge to the very concept of governance itself. If Musk's network had already begun operating outside of federal oversight, then what role did governments even play anymore? How could nations regulate trade, enforce taxation, or maintain order when the very infrastructure they relied upon had been replaced by a private, self-sustaining system that did not require their approval to function? Even before the announcement ended, the White House was in full crisis mode, holding an emergency national security briefing unlike any before it. This was no longer a matter of political rivalry or economic competition. This was an existential threat to the world order. Intelligence agencies had already confirmed that multiple foreign governments were in direct communication with Musk's private network, engaging in early-stage negotiations that suggested they were considering a future where traditional alliances and treaties were no longer relevant. Some leaders saw Musk as an adversary, a rogue disruptor who had launched a silent coup against global institutions. Others saw him as the inevitable evolution of power itself, a force greater than any government could contain. The meeting inside the White House was a chaotic blur of shouting, fragmented strategies, and the growing realization that they were now dealing with a crisis that had no historical precedent. Every countermeasure they proposed was immediately met with an insurmountable obstacle. Legal action would be meaningless against a system that functioned beyond national jurisdictions. Regulatory intervention would be futile when the technology itself no longer required government infrastructure, and direct confrontation was out of the question when no laws had been broken and no violent action had been taken. The only certainty in the room was the rapidly approaching deadline of irreversibility. The longer Musk's system remained online, the more impossible it would become to dismantle it. Every hour that passed meant more businesses, cities, and institutions adapting to the new reality, further cementing the transformation as something that could not be undone. The United States was left with one final, desperate option: an executive order mandating the immediate shutdown of all Tesla, Starlink, and Neuralink operations within U.S. borders. The legality of such an action was questionable. The political ramifications would be catastrophic, and the enforcement of such an order would be unprecedented. But it was no longer a matter of legislation or diplomacy. It was now a matter of survival for governments who had just realized that their authority was no longer guaranteed. As the announcement ended and screens across the world returned to normal broadcasting, the immediate aftermath unfolded in a way no one had predicted. Instead of outrage, fear, or panic, the dominant reaction from the general public was something entirely different: celebration. While governments and corporations were viewing Musk's move as an act of war against the establishment, millions of ordinary people saw it as something else entirely: freedom. For decades, society had been conditioned to accept that energy shortages, financial instability, and economic inequality were unavoidable realities of civilization. But Musk had just proven otherwise. He had bypassed the bureaucratic gridlock, the corporate monopolies, and the political inertia that had kept the world in a perpetual state of controlled chaos. And now, for the first time, people were beginning to wonder whether governments had ever really been necessary at all. Within hours, social media platforms were flooded with messages of support, with citizens from every corner of the world pledging allegiance not to a nation, but to Musk's vision of an ungoverned, decentralized future. Hashtags supporting the transition trended globally. Entire industries began making contingency plans to adjust to the new system, and civil unrest started brewing in cities, where people began demanding immediate adoption of the new infrastructure. Musk had done what no leader, no politician, and no revolutionary had ever managed before. He had made governance itself look obsolete. And the most terrifying realization among those in power was that he had not used force, intimidation, or manipulation to do it. He had simply given people a choice. And now, the world was making that choice without hesitation. The White House had no more time to deliberate. The order for Musk's immediate shutdown was drafted, finalized, and prepared for execution. Government agencies, military advisors, and intelligence specialists were all in agreement. If action wasn't taken immediately, it would soon be too late. But just as the order was about to be signed, an alert came in from the Pentagon. Something new had just happened. Something unexpected. And in that moment, every plan they had just made became completely meaningless. The executive order was ready. The White House had moved past deliberation and hesitation. Every government agency, every intelligence division, and every corporate giant tied to the old world order had reached the same conclusion. Musk's system had to be shut down, and it had to happen now. As the president prepared to sign the order, the Pentagon delivered an urgent alert that shattered every assumption they had made. Musk had not just disrupted their control over energy, finance, and communication. He had made himself untouchable. Over the past 24 hours, his AI-driven system had expanded at an uncontrollable pace. Cities had already begun integrating into the autonomous energy grid. Global corporations, including entire banking networks, were moving their assets into the decentralized system, severing ties with traditional economic structures. The Pentagon's classified satellites confirmed the most chilling revelation. Multiple foreign governments had already pledged allegiance to Musk's new infrastructure. The White House wasn't facing a rogue billionaire with too much influence. It was facing a parallel civilization forming in real time, one that no longer relied on them for survival. Panic turned into something worse: helplessness. With a single directive, Musk had made every government countermeasure meaningless. They could not shut him down because they no longer controlled what needed shutting down. The technology was self-sustaining, decentralized, beyond the reach of regulations or sanctions. Even if they took aggressive action against Musk himself, the system would continue without him. The president lowered his pen. Across the world, people celebrated. Citizens who had once been bound by economic struggles, energy dependency, and government oversight now had an alternative. Governments that refused to adapt found themselves irrelevant overnight. There was no military invasion, no violent revolution, just the slow, unstoppable realization that the world no longer needed those who once ruled it. Musk had not destroyed governments. He had made them obsolete. And with that, the battle was over before it had even begun.